Montana Territory, early November 1879. Snow had started falling early that year, and by the time Fletcher Langley rode out past the timberline, the sky was already heavy with more. His horse snorted against the cold, hooves crunching through the frozen underbrush. Fletcher had spent enough years on the frontier to know when something was wrong, and the silence in these woods was wrong. No birds, no rustle, just wind and something else panic. Then came the yell, thin and sharp. A woman's voice, ragged with fear. He kicked his horse into a gallop, weaving between the pines, rifle slung across his back. When he crested the ridge, he saw her stumbling through the snow, dark skirts tangled around her boots, breath coming in clouds. Wolves were on her, 3 of them, quick and low to the ground, teeth bared. Fletcher did not hesitate. He pulled his Winchester from the sling, aimed high, and fired a warning. The crack echoed through the trees like thunder. The wolves jerked back, startled, then vanished into the woods. The woman froze, chest heaving. She turned toward him, eyes wide and stunned. She looked like she had been running for days. Her coat was torn, scarf missing, hair tangled and wet with snow. "You all right?" Fletcher called, already dismounting. She nodded, but it was shaky. I think so." He walked toward her slow, careful not to spook her. "You hurt?" "No," she said, though her voice caught, "just cold and tired." He shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. "You got a name?" She hesitated, then said, "Marabeth Dwyer." "Fletcher Langley," he replied. "You from around here?" "No, I was headed west. Got separated from my wagon. Everything went wrong. I saw smoke, thought it was a homestead, but it was just a tree struck by lightning. Wolves came after. I ran." He glanced toward the woods. "You are lucky I was out here. Come on, I have a cabin about an hour south." "You will freeze to death out here." "I cannot," she started. "You can," he said, voice firm but not unkind. "You do not have much choice." She looked at him for a long second, then gave a small nod. They rode double on his horse, her arms around his waist, her cheek resting against his back. She was shivering, and Fletcher could feel it through his shirt. When they reached the cabin, he lifted her down and helped her inside. The place was small, 1 room, stove, cot, table, shelves lined with jars of dried food but warm and dry. Marabeth moved stiffly, like her limbs had forgotten how to work. She stood near the stove, hands out, eyes closed. "Sit," Fletcher said, pulling out a chair. "I will fix something hot." She sank down, silent, watching him as he moved around the room. He put on coffee, then ladled out stew from the pot hanging over the fire. When he set the bowl in front of her, she blinked like she had forgotten what food looked like. "I wasn't always like this," she said softly after a few bites. "I had plans. I was going to Oregon. My brother was expecting me, but the man driving the wagon train left me behind when I got sick, said I was slowing them down." Fletcher sat across from her. "That is a hard thing." "I was alone out there, no map, no horse, just started walking." Fletcher's jaw tightened. "He left you to die." She looked at him, and something flickered in her eyes. "But you did not." He held her gaze. "No, I did not." That night she took the cot and he took the floor. They did not talk much more, but as she lay curled beneath his extra blanket, Fletcher watched the firelight flicker across her face. She was strong, he could see it in the way she had kept going, even after being abandoned, chased, nearly frozen. But there was something soft there too. Something tired but not broken. The next morning she woke early, already trying to fold the blanket neatly. "You do not have to do that," he said, stoking the fire. "I do not want to be a burden." "You are not. Besides, it is still snowing." "You are not going anywhere today." She looked out the small, frosted window and sighed. "I suppose not. Stay a few days, rest, get your strength back." Marabeth studied him. "Why are you being kind?" "Because someone should be," he said simply. She smiled then, just a little, but it was real. Over the next few days, the snow piled deeper. Marabeth helped where she could, sweeping, chopping vegetables, even learning to split kindling under Fletcher's watchful eye. She was quiet, but that quiet had weight, not absence. And Fletcher found himself listening to it more than he ever had to words. One night after supper, she looked at him and said, "Why are you out here alone?" He took a breath. Used to be a ranch hand down near Bozeman. Had a girl once. She married someone else while I was out on a cattle drive. Figured I was better off with the trees. Marabeth nodded. I know what it is to feel left behind. He met her eyes. You are not anymore. She held his gaze, and something passed between them then, not rushed, not loud, but steady like a river under ice. Days turned into a week. The storm passed, but neither of them mentioned her leaving. One afternoon they were out near the shed checking the roof for damage. Marabeth slipped on a patch of ice and Fletcher caught her by the waist. For a second they were closer than they had been. You could have let me fall, she said, breathless. Not a chance, he said, eyes locked on hers. She leaned in before she meant to. He kissed her like he was learning how, slow and sure, like he meant every second. When they broke apart, her hands were still on his chest. I was not looking for this, she whispered. Neither was I, he said, but I do not want to let go of it now. She pressed her forehead against his. Me either. That night she did not take the cot, and he did not take the floor. There were no dramatic declarations. No promises shouted into the wind. But the way she curled into him under the blanket, the way he held her like she was something precious, those things spoke just as loud. And outside, the wolves stayed away. The cold hung on well into the second week, though the sky had begun to clear, blue stretching wide over the pines like a new page. Fletcher left early that morning with his rifle slung over one shoulder and a sack over the other, headed toward the river flats where deer sometimes wandered in the thaw. Marabeth watched him go from the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, his coat still too large on her shoulders. Inside, the cabin held a hush. She had begun to move through it with a quiet certainty, not like it was hers, but like she knew what belonged where. She pulled a tin basin from the shelf and set about scrubbing laundry, sleeves rolled to her elbows, knuckles raw from lye and water. The rhythm steadied her. Time had always made more sense when her hands were busy. By the time Fletcher returned, his boots were soaked and a young buck hung from a line over his horse. He paused by the woodshed, nodding at her through the steam of his breath. Could use some help dressing it. Marabeth didn't hesitate. She fetched a knife from the wall and followed him to the shade of the pines where the snow was darker. They worked side by side, her fingers red but sure, his movements practiced and quiet. You ever done this? He asked, glancing at the way she held the blade. Once. With my father, she said. He didn't like me doing it, but I wanted to learn. Fletcher nodded, then returned to his work. After a while, he said, What was he like? She wiped her hands on the hem of her apron. Strict. Thought decency was something earned, not given, but he taught me to read ledgers and mend harness, said survival didn't care if you were a daughter or a son. Fletcher didn't respond right away. The only sound came from the rustle of hide and the creak of rope. My mother died birthing my sister, he said finally. Pa couldn't forgive the land after that, packed us up, moved east, left me with an uncle I didn't know. I came back west the first chance I got. She looked up from the carcass. You stayed because of her? I stayed because I wanted to belong somewhere. Thought maybe the land would answer back if I stuck around long enough. Marabeth ran her fingers over the rough bark of a pine beside them. Maybe it just needed someone to listen. They finished the work in silence, dragging the meat into the shed to cool. Later, inside the cabin, Fletcher lit the lantern while she stirred the pot. The smell of venison filled the room, sharp and clean. You're not restless to leave? He asked as he set the tin plates on the table. She shook her head. I don't think I was headed anywhere that wanted me. Fletcher sat, watching the way her fingers brushed her braid back behind her ear. You could stay. I've thought about it. You don't have to decide now. I already have, she said, looking at him with something calm and certain in her eyes. I just didn't know how to say it. He reached across the table, fingers brushing hers, calloused warmth meeting raw skin. She didn't pull away. That night, she pulled the rocking chair a little closer to the stove and began sewing a patch onto one of his shirts, her needle moving steady through the fabric. Did you ever want children? She asked without looking up. Fletcher leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Used to think about it, but I figured I'd missed my chance. She tied off the thread and looked up. "You haven't." He didn't speak, but the weight of her words settled in the room like ash on snow, quiet, final, and full of meaning. The next morning, Fletcher hitched the team and they rode into the nearest settlement, a small place with a post office, a blacksmith, and a church that listed to one side. He helped her down from the wagon, his hand lingering at her waist. Inside the dry goods store, she picked out calico and thread, a new kettle, a small mirror. Outside, he spoke to the smithy about fresh shoes for the mare. They carried their parcels back to the wagon, the sun low behind them. As they passed the church, Marabeth slowed. "You ever been inside?" she asked. "Not since I was a boy." She looked up at the crooked steeple, then turned to him. "Would you go in with me?" He nodded. They stepped through the old door together, the scent of wood and dust thick in the air. The pews were worn smooth. Light spilled through the cracked glass in long bands. They didn't speak. They just stood there, side by side, the silence between them not empty but full. When they returned to the cabin that evening, she unpacked the mirror and hung it by the window. Fletcher came up behind her, his hands resting at her hips. "I never asked," he said. "But did anyone back east expect you to come home?" She met his eyes in the reflection. "No one I'd go back for," he nodded, then kissed her temple. That night they ate by lamplight, her bare feet tucked under his in the warmth of the stove's reach. The wind outside shifted, but inside the air held steady, and for once neither of them braced for loss. The thaw came slow but steady. Sap rose in the pines. The snow retreated in patches, leaving behind damp earth that clung to boots and held hoofprints deep. Fletcher had taken to checking the traps along the ridge while Marabeth started keeping track of supplies in a small ledger book she found tucked behind a stack of old newspapers. One morning, as she sat at the table squinting at columns of numbers, she said, "You ever think about building on to the cabin?" Fletcher asked, straightening from the stove. "Room for shelves. Maybe a second bed. If we ever needed it." He dried his hands on a rag, then leaned against the counter. "You want to stay long enough to need shelves?" She looked up, pencil still in hand. "I meant what I said. I decided." He nodded, quiet a moment. "I got cedar stacked out back. We could start with that." Outside, the ground was soft enough to dig. Fletcher marked out a new wall line behind the cabin while Marabeth gathered stones from the riverbank. They worked without much talk, passing tools between them, sweat rising under their collars even in the spring chill. By the second week, the frame stood tall behind the original cabin wall. Marabeth watched Fletcher drive nails with steady precision, his hair damp at the temples. "You ever build before?" she asked, handing him another board. "Helped raise a barn once." "This is smaller, but it matters more." She brushed sawdust from her hands. "You think this place will hold us?" "I reckon it already does." That night, while the frame groaned against the wind, they sat at the table with the map she'd carried folded in her satchel. Her finger traced the inked line west, stopping at a smudge near the Columbia River. "You ever think about Oregon still?" he asked. "I used to, thought it meant freedom. But I think I was just looking for somewhere I wouldn't be forgotten." "You think I'd forget you?" She met his eyes across the table. "No, not anymore." Fletcher leaned forward, elbows on the wood. "You ever want to write your brother, let him know where you are?" Marabeth closed the map gently. "He's got a wife and children. I'd only remind him of what he didn't stop." Fletcher didn't push. He reached for her hand instead, his thumb brushing the back of her knuckles. Her fingers curled into his without hesitation. Spring deepened. Birds returned to the trees. Fletcher strung new wire along the pasture fence and traded pelts for seed in town. Marabeth planted potatoes in a square of turned earth and hung linens to dry on a rope between two spruce trees. One afternoon, as she rinsed her hands in the basin, she asked, "You think folks around here would look sideways at a woman staying with a man unwed?" "Likely," Fletcher said, slicing bread at the table. "But I don't give a damn what they think." "What if I did?" He set the knife down slow. "Do you?" She dried her hands on her apron. "Not enough to change my mind." Fletcher stood and crossed the room. "Then maybe we ought to do something about it." Marabeth tilted her head. "You asking? I'm saying I want you in every way a man can, not just in this cabin, not just in spring. I want to build something that lasts." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached up, letting her fingers rest at the curve of his jaw. "Then let's make it right." They rode into town 2 days later dressed in their best. Fletcher wore a clean shirt with the collar stiff, and Marabeth had stitched a new hem onto her calico dress. The preacher met them by the small clapboard church with his book in hand and a quiet nod. The vows were spoken with hands clasped and eyes steady. No guests, no music. Just a promise under a sky that had finally cleared. Afterward, they walked back to the wagon, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. "Wasn't what I imagined," she said, glancing back at the empty steps. "It was enough," he said. "It was everything," she agreed. When they returned home, the light had shifted. The walls of the new room cast long shadows across the floor. Fletcher built a fire while Marabeth unpinned her hair, letting it fall loose across her shoulders. He turned from the hearth and watched her as if seeing her for the first time again. "You look like you belong here," she crossed to him, slipping her arms around his waist. "I do." Outside, wind moved through the pines, carrying with it the scent of wild sage and thawing moss. Inside, the quiet settled deep, not from absence, but from the fullness of being known. And neither of them ever had to run again. A soft rain came in mid-April, the kind that made the roof whisper and coaxed pale green from the black soil behind the cabin. Marabeth stood in the doorway with a shawl over her shoulders, watching the garden rows take shape beneath the drizzle. Fletcher was out by the shed, sharpening the spade, his sleeves rolled and wet to the elbows. "You think the beans'll take?" she asked as he came up the steps. "They'll take," he said, setting the tool aside. "Ground's right for it now." She stepped aside to let him pass. The scent of damp pine clung to him as he pulled off his boots and set them by the hearth. "Something came in the post," she said, nodding toward the table. Fletcher wiped his hands on a cloth before unfolding the letter. The paper had been creased twice, the ink faded at the corners. He read it without speaking, then handed it across the table. Marabeth scanned the words, her brow pulling tight. "It's from your uncle." "First I've heard from him in 3 years," Fletcher said. "Says he's sick, wants to see me." She set the letter down. "You going?" "I don't know yet." She didn't press. Instead, she moved to the stove and ladled broth into a tin cup. Fletcher took it with a nod, the silence between them loose, not stiff. "What kind of man was he?" she asked finally, hard, kept to himself. "But he gave me a place when I didn't have one. That counts for something." Marabeth turned toward the window. The rain had slowed into mist, the kind that stayed in the air like breath too soft to see. "If you go, I'll come with you," she said. "It's a week's ride east." "Nothing easy about it." "I didn't marry you for easy." He looked at her then, really looked, like the first time he saw her standing wild-eyed in the snow. "You sure?" "Yes." By nightfall, they had packed what they needed into 2 bedrolls and a pair of saddle sacks salt pork, dried apples, a spool of thread, flint, and a worn copy of Ezekiel's sermons Fletcher had carried since boyhood. Marabeth tucked away a length of muslin she'd been stitching into a baby gown, though she hadn't said the reason aloud just yet. They left before dawn. The cabin shuddered behind them, smoke trailing faintly from the chimney. The road east wound through a low pass, pine giving way to cottonwood, and the mountains shrinking behind them like something half-remembered. Each night they made camp beneath the stars, Fletcher setting the fire while Marabeth rolled out the blankets. On the 3rd evening, she leaned her back against his chest, his arms around her waist, both of them watching the sparks climb into the dark. "Did you ever think you'd end up like this?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I always hoped." On the 5th day, the land flattened. Fences lined the fields and the smell of cattle drifted on the wind. They crossed a shallow creek where Fletcher paused, eyes on the horizon. "He's just past that rise," he said. Marabeth reached for his hand. "Let's go together." They found the house leaning into the wind, its porch sagging in the middle. Fletcher tied the horses and stepped up to the door. An older man answered, thin and bent, his eyes pale but sharp. "Well," he said, Didn't think you'd come, you wrote, Fletcher said. So I did. The man looked past him to Marabeth. And this, my wife, Fletcher said. The man's eyes narrowed, then he gave a small nod. Come in, then. Inside, the air smelled of pipe smoke and dry wood. A chair near the hearth creaked as the old man sat. You look like your father, he said. I don't remember him much. You were small when they left. He was restless, couldn't settle down. Marabeth stood near the window, her hands clasped in front of her. The silence stretched, filled with things unspoken. I didn't write just to say goodbye, the old man said after a while. There's land out back, old pasture, I want you to have it. Fletcher didn't answer. He looked around the room at the empty shelves, the cracked floorboards, the way the man's coat hung too loose from his frame. You're not dying, Fletcher said. The man's mouth tightened. Not yet. But I'm alone. Marabeth stepped forward. You want company more than anything else. The old man looked at her, then back at Fletcher. Maybe. Fletcher glanced at Marabeth, then back at the man who'd raised him. I'll think on it. They stayed 2 nights. Marabeth cleaned the stove, Fletcher patched the roof's worst corner. On the morning they were set to leave, the old man came out with a sack of seed and a small tin box. These were your mother's, he said. She kept them close. Fletcher opened the box. Inside were 2 buttons, a ribbon and a scrap of paper with a child's scrawl. He didn't speak, just closed it and nodded. On the ride home, the wind was behind them. Fletcher reached across the saddle and touched Marabeth's hand where it rested on the pommel. I didn't know she kept anything, he said. Now you do. He looked at her, and something in his face shifted, less guarded, more open than she'd ever seen. We'll build that extra room after all. We'll need it, she said quietly. He turned toward her, the horses moving slow beneath them. You're sure? She nodded. I've been sure since before the beans sprouted. The land opened up ahead, their cabin just out of sight, waiting. Fletcher smiled, a real one, rare and steady. They didn't speak again for a while. They didn't need to. The soil warmed with the season, and the cabin settled into a rhythm that felt older than both of them combined. Fletcher rose before the sun now, not out of habit but purpose, and Marabeth moved slower in the mornings, her hand resting low over the curve beneath her waistband. The muslin gown had been finished weeks ago and folded into the chest at the foot of their bed, stitched with quiet hope. One afternoon, Fletcher returned from the eastern edge of the pasture, his shirt clinging from sweat, a coil of fence wire slung over one shoulder. Marabeth stood by the new room's open window, brushing a damp cloth over the sill. She turned as he stepped in, his boots leaving prints on the plank floor. I saw a man riding up from the south trail, he said, setting the coil down. Didn't look like from town. Wagon behind him. She wiped her hands on her apron. You think he's headed here? Could be. Looks like he's stopping up at the crossing for now. She didn't ask more. Instead, she poured a mug of water and passed it to him. He drank slow, eyes still turned toward the window. By dusk, the wagon rolled into view. A lean man with a sun-creased face sat at the reins, one arm in a sling, the other steady on the brake. Behind him, a woman with a wide-brimmed hat and 2 children tucked beneath a blanket stared out with cautious eyes. The wheels creaked as they stopped at the edge of the yard. Fletcher stepped down from the porch. Evening. The man nodded, lowering himself stiffly to the ground. Name's Ezra Cole. We came out of Kansas. Storm wrecked our rig outside Fort Benton. We've been walking and patching since. Marabeth joined Fletcher, her hands folded in front of her. You've got little ones, you need a roof. Ezra glanced back at the wagon. Just for the night, if you've got room. Fletcher looked toward the new room, then at Marabeth. She didn't hesitate. Come in. They gave up their bed that night, laying a mattress by the hearth for themselves. The children slept curled on the cot, their mother stretched between them. Ezra sat near the fire, his injured arm resting on his lap. I was a smith before the drought hit, he said low, careful not to wake the others. Then the fever took my wife's folks, so we left. Figured Montana might give us a new start. Marabeth passed him a cup of broth. It might, but it's not kind. Kind don't matter, Ezra said. Just need a place to try. By morning, Ezra's youngest had a fever. Marabeth crushed the last of the willow bark and steeped it in a cup, laying cool cloths over the boy's forehead. Fletcher rode 2 hours north to fetch more quinine from the trading post, returning with a satchel of supplies and a raw rasp in his throat from wind and worry. The child improved by the second evening. Ezra stood outside that night, his sling stiff with dried sweat. Fletcher joined him, passing over a tin cup of water. "You've got hands," Fletcher said, "and if your boy's well enough to travel, I've got an old shed that needs a roof and a forge that's sat quiet too long." Ezra turned toward him. "You offering work, offering a place. If you're willing to earn it." Ezra looked back toward the cabin where his wife's silhouette crossed the window, tucking a blanket. "We are." By the end of the week, the Coles had moved into the old bunkhouse, patching the roof with cedar Fletcher hauled from the ridge. Ezra set up a forge beside the shed, and by midsummer, the ring of hammer on iron joined the morning birdsong. Marabeth sat beneath the ash tree one afternoon, mending a pair of Fletcher's trousers, her feet in the grass. Fletcher approached with a bucket of water and knelt beside her. "Think they'll stay?" she asked. "They've already started planting behind the bunkhouse, that's a kind of answer." She nodded, threading her needle again. "It's strange having voices nearby." "Strange," he said, "but good." She looked up at him, her eyes warm. "You think the land's answering back now?" He brushed a speck of sawdust from her cheek. "I think it's been listening all along." That evening, Marabeth lit the lantern early. Fletcher came in just as the first stars appeared, setting his hat on the hook. She stood by the basin, one hand resting low again, slower now, heavier. "She kicked today," she said. He crossed the room in 2 steps, his hand resting over hers. "I didn't feel it yet," he said. Marabeth took his hand and pressed it to the side of her belly. They waited. Then flutter, firm and certain, Fletcher's breath caught just for a second. "That's her." "She's strong," Marabeth said. He leaned his forehead against hers. "So's her mother." That summer the harvest came early, the earth generous after such a bitter winter. Fletcher built a rocking chair for the porch, carving the back with a pattern of pine needles and small stars. Marabeth tied off the last of the baby quilts and aired them under the eaves. Ezra's forge burned steady, and his wife began teaching the local children under the ash tree on Sundays. Fletcher built a bench for them to sit on, and Marabeth baked bread after the lessons, passing it out with honey and laughter. One clear morning in late September, Marabeth woke him with her hand on his shoulder and a quiet, purposeful breath. He didn't speak, just rose and lit the lamp, his heart beat louder than the wind outside. The birth was long, but not hard. Ezra's wife stayed with her while Fletcher paced the yard, hands clenched, eyes turned to the window. At dusk, a cry rose up a high, small thing that wrapped around his ribs like a rope. He entered slow, his boots silent on the wood. Marabeth lay in the bed, hair damp, cheeks flushed. In her arms, wrapped in the muslin gown, was a girl no bigger than a loaf of bread. "Come meet her," Marabeth whispered. Fletcher stepped close and reached down, his hand trembling as he touched the child's tiny fingers. They curled around him. "She's got your eyes," he said. "And your jaw," Marabeth replied, smiling. He kissed her forehead, then the crown of their daughter's head. "You did it." "We did." The room smelled of milk and wood smoke, and the hush that followed was not silence but fullness. That fall, Fletcher built a cradle from the same cedar as the cabin walls. Marabeth planted bulbs behind the porch. The children from the bunkhouse helped gather apples, their laughter rising above the trees. Winter came slow that year, and when it did, the hearth burned warm and no one was alone. And every night, when the fire settled low and the baby sighed in her sleep, Fletcher would hold Marabeth close beneath the quilt she'd stitched with her own hands. Not for warmth, not for comfort, but for the simple, unshakable truth of it, they had found home in each other. And they never let it go.